Woke supremacy news.
History. Because it's a constant feature of public discourse these days. Do you call things what they are, or do you tread carefully, super cautiously? Since sometimes words mean different things to different people. And some words are just controversial. Well, I've been talking about fascism almost non-stop on this network for more than 2 years now, since Donald Trump called for troops on American streets to, quote, dominate Black Lives Matter protesters, since he called on violent racist Proud Boys to stand back and stand by ahead of the 2020 election, since he refused to accept his big loss in that election and helped incite the violent January 6th insurrection. But now I have a little more company. Did you hear about what the President of the United States said recently? And I quote, "What we're seeing now is the beginning or the death knell of an extreme MAGA philosophy. It's not just Trump, it's the entire philosophy. I'm going to say something, it's like semi-fascism." The president made those comments last Thursday at a fundraiser in Maryland as he kicked off his campaign for Democrats in the midterm elections. Of course, Fox and the Republicans aren't taking the whole semi-fascism thing very well.
The RNC responded, calling the president's remarks despicable.
You don't attract voters by first insulting them. Alienating voters is no way to get their attention and affection.
President Biden was attacking Republicans generally. He was not talking about the people who assaulted the Capitol that sits to the south of us here. He was attacking the entire party.
If I remember, this was the guy, the candidate at the time to be president that said he was going to bring everybody together, and then to call half of America fascists. Come on. He owes an apology. That's not appropriate. That isn't leadership.
Was that Kellyanne Conway I heard there saying, you can't win over voters by insulting them? Right. You know what? I disagree with Biden too. How could he say that? How could he? I mean, there's nothing semi about MAGA's fascism. It's full on, Mr. President. And if you think that's unfair, well, I defer to writer Mike Godwin, who in 1990 formulated Godwin's Law, the humorous idea that sooner or later in any online argument, someone will bring up Hitler or the Nazis. What does Mike Godwin think about all this? Quote, "People have asked me my opinion of President Biden's criticism of semi-fascism. Well, I can't overstate my disapproval of the inappropriate use of semi. Great minds think alike. Conservatives can go crazy over it, but the fact of the matter is American elite and public opinion is shifting on the F word. And it's because of Republicans' behavior. Take longtime Columbia University historian and fascism scholar Robert Paxton, who spent much of the Trump administration explaining why he didn't think the label fit Trump. He said Trump wasn't a fascist. Then came January the 6th and Paxton's change of heart. Quote, "Trump's incitement of the invasion of the Capitol on January the 6th, 2020 removes my objection to the fascist label," he wrote. "His open encouragement of civic violence to overturn an election crosses a red line. The label now seems not just acceptable, but necessary." That civic violence line from Paxton is key. Because the good faith liberal objection to applying the fascist label to Republicans between 2016 and 2020 was that there was no organized street violence, no private militias ready to do the bidding of their leader. That's what defines fascism, they said. Well, all that changed on 1/6. And in the more than 18 months since, Republicans have tried to block the January 6th investigations while downplaying the threat posed by extremist, pro-insurrection, neo-fascist militias and violent street gangs like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. Since 1/6, there have even been multiple attempted domestic terror attacks from far-right people. Last year at this time, Capitol Police arrested a man claiming to have a bomb in a standoff at the Library of Congress, but he had a defender in Congress, Republican Mo Brooks, who responded to the threat with a press release saying he understood, quote, "citizenry anger directed at a dictatorial socialism." And earlier this month, after the FBI search for classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, Republican politicians were incensed, slamming the search before all the details came out, the horrific details. They were slamming it with inflammatory and hyperbolic language. Later that same week, a Trump supporter attacked the FBI office in Cincinnati with an AR-15 and a nail gun before dying in a shootout that followed. His social media posts after the Mar-a-Lago search appeared to call for violence. Republicans could turn down the temperature, but instead they're running in the other direction with their own ominous and very dark warnings. Just this weekend, a man who was once considered a relatively moderate Republican senator, issued what I can only describe as a threat of street violence. Listen for yourself.
Take me to the ocean, take me to the sea.
Listen for yourself.
If there's a prosecution of Donald Trump for mishandling classified information after the Clinton debacle, which you presided over and did a hell of a good job, there'll be riots in the streets.
Senator Graham didn't follow up that horrific statement. He didn't follow it up by saying, that would be bad and stupid and un-American. You shouldn't do it. No. He didn't say the rule of law must be maintained. No. The man who once associated himself with John McCain's brand of centrist straight talk, who once ran bipartisan negotiations on immigration reform, and who tweeted 6 years ago, if we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed and we will deserve it. Well, he's now playing footsie with the fascists. Why the change? Maybe that's the lawless GOP personality cult at play. As Biden also put it in his comments on semi-fascism, quote, the MAGA Republicans don't just threaten our personal rights and economic security, they're a threat to our very democracy. They refuse to accept the will of the people. They embrace political violence. They don't believe in democracy. And where is the lie in that? And I'm sorry, but the same people who are in one breath threatening street violence to protect their dear leader from the law can't then in the next breath get angry about the fascist label being applied to them. Joining me now is Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Professor of History and Italian Studies at NYU, publisher of the Lucid newsletter on threats to democracy and author of the 2020 book, Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present. Also here is Molly Jong-Fast, contributing writer at The Atlantic, author of the Wait What newsletter and host of the New Abnormal podcast. Thank you both for coming back on the show. Ruth, you and I have been speaking about this subject since 2015. You have called Trump authoritarian. You wrote a book about strongmen that went from Mussolini to Trump. But correct me if I'm wrong, you yourself in the past shied away from using the F word, the fascist label. So what do you think now of Joe Biden calling the MAGA movement semi-fascist?
I think it's perfect. I think it's justified. Now, the semi is that, you know, today the fascism or authoritarianism doesn't work the same way. There's rarely a shutdown of all other parties and a shutdown of all other media. Today, you keep elections and then you fix them, like Viktor Orban does in Hungary. But it's out of the question that, you know, Trump absolutely takes many, many things from fascism, from the leader cult to the loyalty oaths to now, you know, the solicitation of violence and considering violence as an acceptable way of doing politics. And that's why Trump's in my book in the first place. You know, Mussolini on one end and Trump on the other end, because there's so much continuity in the things that he does.
And Ruth, I've got to ask you about the international comparison here, because a lot of Republicans are playing victim as ever, saying, oh, this is like, you know, they're trying to compare it to Obama's guns and God remarks, Hillary Clinton's deplorables. You're insulting the entire Republican voter base. But of course, millions of people can vote for fascism without being fascist themselves. I mean, we look at France, where Marine Le Pen just got to the final round of the presidential election. You mentioned Hungary and Orban. There is a distinction between the movement, which Biden is attacking, and the fact that some people, a lot of people, do find the movement attractive.
They do, and it's important to learn from the fact that from fascism onward, these movements have been able to attract people, giving them a sense of community and really leveraging emotions, usually negative emotions, of victimhood. And in fact, the GOP needs to be put in this authoritarian party framework, because one of the really disturbing things they've done that's out of this tradition is get people way past polarization. Polarization is it's us versus them. Now we're at it's us or them, and only one of us is going to survive. So there's a lot of these extreme discourses now, like great replacement theory and other things that get people to feel that violence is the only way justified. And that's part of being in the community, is to espouse violence.
Very extreme indeed. Molly, can I ask an obvious question? Have you, like me, been waiting a long time for the President of the United States, for the leader of the Democratic Party, to use the F word?
It's amazing. It's this dark Brandon, this Biden who has decided now to take the power. He's forgiving student loan debt. He's saying what we've all been thinking this whole time. It's amazing, and he seems unfettered. I mean, the truth is these people are more offended to be called fascists than to stop doing the fascism, right? Like, if you don't want to be called fascist, then make it so people can vote, and don't try to consolidate power, and don't, do this sort of weird stuff that Republicans have done on the state level towards Democratic governors, like in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
You don't do fascist stuff if you don't want to be called a fascist. This is not hard. So, I was excited to see Biden do it. I think most of us agreed with him. And he said semi because, he's a traditionalist.
He's baby steps. A few years ago, he was saying they would have an epiphany and work with him. Now they're semi-fascist. It's funny that you mentioned the kind of fake outrage and doing fascist things. I saw a segment on Monday morning on Fox where they were saying this is outrageous that Biden said this thing, and at that very moment, Trump was posting on his website that we should rerun the 2020 election or just reinstall him as president at the very same time. So the irony there. But let me ask you this, Molly. Let's put aside the bad faith people on the right with their kind of victimhood. There are genuine criticisms of the use of the fascist label. Shadi Hamid of the Brookings Institute, he tweeted a bunch of things I didn't agree with over the weekend, but he did tweet this one line which struck out to me. He said, if you believe the Republican Party is fascist, then it would require you to believe that a legal ban on the GOP is justified. Either that, or you're not taking fascism seriously enough. That is precisely what some democracies have done when facing an imminent fascist threat. And I just wonder, look, obviously no one is proposing you ban the GOP. As Ruth pointed out, it's a very different, a very different movement now. These are people who do want to contest elections, even if they don't accept the results. But there is a question mark about how seriously Democrats are taking this fascist threat. I mean, you use the label, but then at the same time, we know the DCCC and other Democratic groups were funding some of these fascistic candidates as a kind of way of dividing the GOP and getting the candidate they want from the primaries in the general. Is the Democratic Party as a whole still taking the extremist threat from the far right, from this fascistic GOP, seriously enough, Molly?
Well, I think that's a good point. And I was really against the Democrats funding these real fringe candidates because I think it was really bad for democracy. And Democrats need to win fair and square, and they don't need to support people like these Doug Mastriano types because it's not worth it for democracy. It's better, in my mind, to lose to a reasonable Republican. I mean, I don't know if it's better, but it's certainly opening the door to stuff that we have seen we can't control. Remember all the people in 2015 who were thrilled that Trump was the nominee and thought he would be easily beaten by Hillary Clinton.
The Pied Piper, I believe he was called by the DNC.
Exactly. We've been here before, and I think it's a huge mistake. I do think there are Republicans who I don't agree with politically, but who believe in democracy and the rule of law and don't want to contest elections. There aren't that many of them, but there are a few of them. And I think that we'll see if Trump keeps losing elections for these people, we will see this sort of non-Trumpy party take back the party, I think, eventually, but it's going to take a while, and Democrats are going to have to keep power.
First, they have to accept that they've lost the damn elections. Let me ask you this, Ruth. An NBC News poll found last week that voters' number one issue today is not inflation or jobs, but threats to democracy. And among voters who say threats to democracy are the most important issue facing the country, 68% prefer the Democratic Party to control Congress. So not only is Joe Biden seemingly on the right track here with his rhetoric, but you and I and others who have been warning about this democratic crisis we're in, who were told voters don't care about this stuff. It's all about kitchen table issues, and kitchen table issues defined not as democracy or abortion rights, but as just inflation or gas prices. I mean, the polling suggests otherwise.
Yeah, I was really happy to see that all the messaging we've all been doing is getting through, because it's really disturbing. If you look at the history of authoritarian parties and put the GOP into it, the types of people they're in the middle of this big remaking of themselves to support some kind of illiberal rule. And that means people who stand up for the rule of law, like Cheney, have to be out. And who's coming in? Actual lawless people. And fascism, go back to fascism. they always recruited criminals to come into the party because they were already corrupt, they were already violent. And that's what's happening now, where all these people who are oath keepers are being put ahead for, positions like Arizona Secretary of State, actual members of Oath Keepers. So if you take the big picture and look at what is happening to the party and all the lawless and violent people coming in, then no wonder, voters are concerned finally about this in large enough numbers to reflect in that poll.
Molly, you said a moment ago that there are still Republicans who believe in democracy, still believe in the law. They may be a minority, but they're there. One thing about that poll that I just mentioned to Ruth, the NBC News poll, is that it also shows that a big chunk of voters, maybe a third, who say democracy is the #1 issue, they prefer Republicans taking control of Congress. They're the kind of people who say democracy is my #1 issue because they believe the last election was stolen. That's what's driving their concerns about democracy. And they are not a small number of people in this country. They are tens of millions of Americans.
Yeah, they are. They're the GOP base. But the good news is what we saw in 2020 was that Trump doesn't have he doesn't have the majority, right? He has this base. He can win the primaries, but he can't win the general. And I think more and more we're seeing, maybe I'm just a cockeyed optimist, but more and more, I think we're seeing that people are turning against this. Just like with Roe, they don't like this kind of, for lack of a better word, religious, kind of fascistic government. They want a normal government with all of its flaws. So I do think I do think that Trumpism could conceivably peter out.